Thank you so much, and thank you for this invitation to speak to this fine group of Londoners this morning. I've attended many Canadian Club luncheons over the years, I'm sure over the past 30 years, and have heard some very good speakers, so I am obviously honored to be asked to speak to this group today, even if it is 8 o'clock in the morning. The Canadian Club of London theme to share and promote our passion for Canada. And that is why I'm here, because I have a passion for this country and for this city. And I do want to talk about some of that this morning. I see so many familiar faces. As I look around the room, I want to just wave at everyone. Anyway, thank you for that kind introduction. And in some ways, I think I look at the role that I've taken over the years, and I sometimes think that my job, my career, has been leading to this moment. So I want to talk about that today, about how I've got here and some of the challenges that our government face and some of the prospects for the future. I look out the window of the London West constituency office on Commissioners Road, and I see the remains of my grade school, Brick Street Public School. I grew up around the corner. And for the past month, I have watched as workers have torn the school down, which may be a metaphor of some type, but I'm not sure. But everything really does come full circle, and it's fitting at times like this to take stock, take a bird's eye view of what has happened to me, to this community, and our country, which I hope to do today. I would also like to touch on how far we have come as a government in our first 150 days, give or take a week or two. During the election campaign, we promised to strengthen the middle class, initiate a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, bring 25,000 Syrian refugees to Canada, reform the Senate, reinstate the long-form census, and restore Canada's place as a global leader in the fight against climate change. The Government of Canada introduced concrete plans to address all of these commitments in the very first week that Parliament was in session. On day one of our mandate, Prime Minister Trudeau announced the first gender-balanced cabinet in Canadian history that made front-page news around the world, and it really is about time. Being a woman in a man's world has always been a theme throughout my career. Many people were surprised when they heard I had decided to run for political office, saying they didn't know I was interested in politics, to which I would say, if you're a journalist, you have to be interested in politics. That's what you do so much of, is reporting about the political life. But unlike some of my very young colleagues on the benches of the House of Commons, my foray into politics followed a full career in journalism and public relations. Journalists, of course, will tell you that anyone who leaves journalism for public relations has gone to the dark side. Anyone leaving journalism to go into politics is even worse. And I've done both. Like many young people, I struggled to decide what I wanted to do when I grew up, and my mother and father really didn't, I must admit, they didn't really have high hopes for me. My mom thought I would be a secretary, like she was. And I don't think my dad really gave it a lot of thought, to be honest. It was actually two high school teachers who, for whatever reason, saw something in me and sat me down and told me that I should apply for a new course at Fanshawe College called broadcast journalism. They were certain it was the key to my future. And they were right. I loved it. It gave me the rare opportunity to interview a number of important Canadians, including a number of prime ministers. I have always joked that I only interviewed prime ministers who didn't last very long. John Turner, Kim Campbell, and Joe Clark. And no, I never did get a chance to interview Pierre Elliott Trudeau, one of my great disappointments. My television interview with Prime Minister John Turner, by the way, you really will recall he was Prime Minister for less than a year. It happened in this very hotel. It was 1984, and it was about a week away from the federal election in which he ultimately lost to Brian Mulroney. His campaign team decided that only the local media would be allowed to interview the Prime Minister. They were afraid the national media would ask him too many tough questions. Because it was just after his disastrous debate with Brian Mulroney when he challenged Turner on the Senate appointments. Doesn't that seem a little strange in hindsight? So while the national media couldn't ask any questions, they all sat and watched me do the interview, including, of all people, Pamela Wallin, who I could tell was put out by not being allowed to interview the Prime Minister. To think the big issue was Senate appointments is quite remarkable in hindsight. On radio, I interviewed Canadian authors like W.O. Mitchell, who snuffed tobacco throughout the entire interview. His sweater was covered in tobacco droppings. Pierre Burton, who was gracious when he showed up a week early for the interview and I hadn't read his book. The two most challenging interviews were with two women, Sheila Copps and Margaret Atwood. They both liked a good argument, and I admit I was more than a bit intimidated by both of them. Getting a chance to talk to interesting people was what made being a journalist so exciting, but anchoring the news was completely different. There is a reason that they call it being a news anchor, because you are anchored to that desk. And what I turned into over the years, over the 18 years that I did the job, was essentially a news reader. I didn't feel like a journalist. You have to remember what television was like back in the 80s when I started. Women in smaller cities, like London, didn't anchor the news alone. We always needed a male anchor right beside us. And over the years, I found women were my harshest critics, and people would be fixated on my hair and what I wore. I'm still fixated on that. It wasn't as glamorous as some made out it to be. Just ask my children. I've never encouraged them to watch the news, the television news, so they were quite often confused, especially my young daughter, by all the fuss made when we would go shopping. People would recognize me everywhere. The TV station, CFPL-TV as it was called then, I've given up keeping track of what it's called now, but at that time, when I left, it was owned by City TV. And when I announced I wanted to step down, Moses Neimer said to me, quote, "I hear the glow of the red light is waning." He was referring to the red light on top of the cameras that turn on when you're broadcasting live. I said, "If by that you mean I'm tired of anchoring the news," I said, "yes." He said I was the first news anchor he had ever known to willingly give up the job. People are either fired or they die. I wanted to beat them to the punch. I was in my late 40s and just couldn't see myself aging on television. It didn't help that the big screen TVs were coming out at that time. Your face is blown up 10 times the normal size. I just said, no, this is not for me. So I'd been thinking about leaving for about 5 years and started to talk to a few connected Londoners, some are here this morning, about my desire to get into something different, such as public relations or communications. I stayed at CFPL-TV as the manager of community relations for another few years, but ultimately left to take a public relations job with TD Bank Financial Group, which had merged with Canada Trust in 2000. When I started in the bank over 10 years ago, there was still very much a feeling of loss in London. Canada Trust was an icon in this city, and TD knew that they needed to prove to Londoners that we still mattered. They wanted to raise their profile and asked me to help them out. In the process, TD Bank decided to sponsor Sunfest, donate $500,000 to the London Health Sciences Centre, and became strong supporters of the Pride Parade. After working at TD Bank for 3 years, it became apparent to me that if I wanted to climb the corporate ladder, I would have to move to Toronto, and I just didn't see that happening. My dad was aging at the time, my children still needed my support, my marriage had broken up, and so I needed to, again, figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. It was then that I found out that the Thames Valley District School Board was looking for someone to manage community relations and handle media relations. It seemed like a good fit, and having a chance to work with my dear friend, Bill Tucker, who was Director of Education at the time, was a huge motivating factor. I hadn't been in the job for more than a few months when I received a visit from a Conservative Party member who said he wanted me to consider getting into politics. He thought with my background, expertise, and high profile in the community, I would be a perfect candidate. I was flattered, but the one thing he didn't know, and I was glad he couldn't tell, I was not a Conservative. I had been raised a Liberal. My parents were not big fans of Conservative Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. My dad worked at Avro Aero, and it was Diefenbaker who shut down the iconic Canadian aeronautics manufacturer. The story of the Avro Aero became a part of our family history, with pictures of the impressive plane hanging on our walls. One of those pictures is now hanging in my Ottawa office. And I think my dad would be pretty proud that his daughter is now Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport. Through all my years in television, I had done all I could not to show my true political stripes. The fact that the Conservatives asked me to run was very intriguing. Not that I was interested, but the idea did cross my mind. What would I say if the Liberals asked me? What would I say then? To say the seed was planted that day may be stretching the point, but it did set things in motion. I found myself getting more and more agitated by what was happening in Ottawa. Over the course of the next few years, I watched in dismay as the Conservative government started to change the course of this great country. And when Prime Minister Harper prorogued the government for the second time, I decided I couldn't sit idly by any longer. That's when I became a card-carrying Liberal at a time when Liberals were bailing from the party. But I never lost hope. I always believed in the Liberal brand, and while I wasn't prepared to jump in with both feet, I did feel a growing sense of responsibility to do something. When Justin Trudeau was named Liberal leader, it felt exciting, it felt right. But as I learned throughout the long election campaign, not everyone believed the way I did. It wasn't until 3 weeks before the election that I could tell we were going to win. We just didn't realize how big the win was going to be. I still can't say I was prepared when Doug Ferguson called me and asked if I would consider putting my name forward for the Liberal nomination in London West. It's a huge personal decision. The word was out that all ridings across the country were being encouraged by the Liberal leader to reach out to women and ask them to run. And I know that there were many London women who were approached, some probably sitting here this morning. But in the end, in London West, I was the only one who decided to take that leap of faith. And it's not a decision you can or should make on your own. Your family has to be on your side. I had to make sure this was something not only I wanted to do, but my partner, Brian Meehan, wanted to do as well. This type of job is 24/7. Being a politician is all-encompassing. I reached out to former politicians like Glenn Pearson and Sue Barnes about whether I should do this. To my friends, the friends who had known me professionally for many years, like Helen Wainman, who's here this morning, they were very supportive, while my friends who knew me on a more personal level were more cautious. They wanted to protect me from what they saw as a world that is totally unforgiving. Let's face it, politicians are not respected, but like our Prime Minister, I also believe better is always possible. After 6 weeks of talking over and over again about this, the pros and cons, and analyzing whether jumping into the nomination race was something I wanted to do, I decided the only way that I could really tell was to put on red and go door knocking. So I did that, and it felt good. It was tough, really tough cold calling and telling people you were considering putting your name forward. Would they buy a $10 membership and come out and vote for you at the nomination meeting? It doesn't sound like much, $10. But it's pretty daunting when you consider how many people you have to ask and how many people say no. Being a politician is all about the connections you make with people. You're a salesperson, communicator, even a performer at times, and you have to love people. Former Toronto Mayor Rob Ford will be buried today. I want to take a moment to say that with all his faults, and he had a number of them, he truly loved helping the little guy. And it's not easy trying to help everyone who comes to you with problems. Some of them you can't solve. But Rob Ford was able to tap into that part of being a politician that can at times be the most challenging. Being all things to all people, he liked being the fixer. Problem was, no one could fix Rob. The people most devoted to him were unable to rein him in. His team became paralyzed, and this larger-than-life character began to quickly unravel. Politics has a way of changing people, both for the good and the bad. I've heard many stories since I've been on Parliament Hill about lives that have broken apart because of the grueling hours, the distance from family and friends. Just last week, the death of a 41-year-old Conservative member of Parliament was shocking to all of us, but it underscored how important it is to have a right balance. I've since spoken with Karen Vecchio, who is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Elgin, Middlesex, London, who said his commitment to the job, while admirable, was also a warning to all MPs. You have to take care of your health, both physically and mentally. There are many young people in the House of Commons with young families. In fact, an NDP MP brings her 6-month-old to question period almost every day. I noticed last week that she had bought him headphones to wear to deaden the noise. Question period can get very unruly, and we're trying to change that. The Liberal caucus is seriously discussing ways to make the House of Commons more family-friendly so that we can encourage younger people to get involved. Having a loving, supportive family is one key to success, both in winning the election and once you're in Ottawa. Building a great team is also very important. I've listened to so many speeches from politicians my entire life, and the one thing they always say is, I couldn't do this without my great team. I had no idea how true that was until I started building that team. Many of them are here today, and I couldn't have done it without any of you. I mean, it's just amazing the work you do. But I had to prove to them, as I had to prove to the electorate, that I had what it would take to beat a Conservative cabinet minister who was well-liked and respected in the community. I've known Ed Holder for many years and knew he would be disappointed that I had decided to run against him. I called to let him know that it wasn't personal. I just couldn't sit by and let the Harper government move Canada in a direction that I found so unacceptable. He asked me why I didn't consider running in another riding. I told him that I was raised in London West. I raised my family in London West, and I live here now. I didn't want to run anywhere else. Begrudgingly, I think he understood. I went on to win the London West nomination, Liberal nomination, in late November 2014, and by January 2015, the team was door-knocking every weekend, which is an experience. You have to be prepared for almost everything. Early on, it was evident the Conservative ads that questioned if Justin Trudeau had what it takes to be Prime Minister were working. I would constantly say, Justin Trudeau will make a fine Prime Minister. But it wasn't an easy perception to break, even when Justin Trudeau was riding high in the polls. About a year ago, we were also battling this perception that the Liberal platform wasn't well known. We were being asked for more specifics of what we would do if we were elected. Of course, at that time, we were the third party, and the majority of people didn't think we had a hope of even forming the opposition. The one person who believed we would win was Justin Trudeau. He was always on message, and he was and is incredibly dynamic, which made it all the more depressing when the Conservative ads seemed to be taking hold. At a Liberal conference in January of last year, all Liberal candidates were told to be patient, that the polls would probably turn against us, but that was okay. We wanted the electorate to take a close look at the New Democrats and believed on close inspection they wouldn't do well. We also believed that if we stayed on course throughout the entire campaign and presented our platform systematically throughout the spring and summer, it would resonate with voters. Of course, we had no idea that the Conservatives and New Democrats would make mistakes that clearly worked in our favor. Did we expect to win and win so big? No one really knew what to expect, but I would be lying if I said I never had my doubts. The night of the election, I stayed upstairs in my bedroom going over my acceptance speech. I figured that by then it would be bad luck to draft a concession speech. And Brian came running up and said, "You've got to come down and watch what's happening. We've swept the Maritimes." And now it was time to watch the results coming in for Ontario. I'm not sure when it actually did sink in that we had won, and by 8,000 votes. Ed Holder did come and make a gracious concession speech at my victory party, which was a very classy thing to do, and I know how difficult it was. And someday that could be me. But for now, I'm focused on the next 4 years and beyond, and what the Liberal government can and will do for this country. And as I mentioned off the top, we have done a great deal in our short time in office. Probably the most significant is bringing 25,000 Syrian refugees so quickly, but not without a lot of help from local church groups who have opened their arms and wallets to help these families start a new life. Mayor Matt Brown and I have been to a number of Syrian refugees get-togethers, and it just brings tears to your eyes. They're so happy and to be here, and the church is so happy to have gone and done all the work that it takes to make sure that they have a life here. Well, last week's budget was more than 5 months in the making. Just before he brought down the budget, I asked Finance Minister Bill Morneau if he was ready. He said, "Yes, I just hope people realize that this is only the first budget. We can't get everything in the first time," and he's right, but I think we're on the right path, the path to prosperity, and we are determined to invest in the future of Canada. I was fortunate to hold 2 pre-budget consultation events in London in conjunction with the London Chamber of Commerce and the Pillar Nonprofit Network, who together represent more than 1,300 businesses and social enterprises located in London. And when also taking into account what constituents had told me at local events, over the phone and emails, and of course going door to door during the campaign, they kept telling that they wanted the government to do more to support the middle class and those working hard to join the middle class, which is why we have followed through on our commitment to reduce the middle class tax bracket from 22 to 20.5%. By delivering these savings, we are putting more money in the pockets of Canadians to save, invest, and grow our economy. In all, we will be cutting taxes for 9 million Canadians. By introducing the Canada Child Benefit, we will lift hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. 9 out of 10 Canadian families will receive more assistance under our child benefit programs than was available under the previous government. Looking around the room, I know the number one question this morning, without a doubt, on everyone's mind is, will the federal government commit to funding London's light rail transit proposal? The short answer is, I don't know. Sorry, Matt. The city has made a convincing case to both the provincial and federal governments, and the project is well aligned with what the federal government hopes to achieve, developing our infrastructure that will create steady jobs and will help grow the economy. Just before the election, Justin Trudeau came to London and expressed his support for the idea. Of course, there are many municipalities across the country seeking infrastructure dollars, and we all know that. But the city is working on their business plan, and we're really looking forward to seeing that and seeing what will happen. I am very committed to whatever plan the City of London decides is best. I am committed to advancing that plan. When I was named Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport, I was inundated with emails and text messages saying how great this was for London, that this would help us get the money for transit. I had to quickly put that notion to rest. First off, transport and infrastructure are 2 different departments completely. If it hasn't been built yet, like Windsor's Gordie Howe Bridge, then it falls under infrastructure. If it's been built already, like the Ambassador Bridge, it comes under transport. Once it's built, transport will regulate it. So let's be clear, in the coming weeks, months, and years, there will be many difficult decisions and sleepless nights for parliamentarians. The actions taken by our government will be supported and opposed by different cross-sections of society on a case-by-case basis. That's all part of living in a great democracy. Challenging decisions will need to be made on a whole host of issues, including physician-assisted dying, contentious motions like TPP and Bill C-51, and I know that you'll be watching every step of the way. Sometimes when I return back to my London West constituency office after a long week in Ottawa and I gaze out the window overlooking my former elementary school that is now a pile of rubble, I wonder, as I said off the top, if this is a metaphor to the rebuilding of a better Canada with a more inclusive and positive government. That's what I'm going to take away from it. Perhaps the greatest takeaway from our first 150 days in office is that the forward-looking change that was once the cornerstone of our campaign is starting to look like just the way things will continue to be, which is just fine with me, and even better for my children and grandchildren who call London home. Thank you very much.